Well, as you heard, this morning's Bible story is about a burial. But I want to begin this morning by talking about a resurrection. The Kansas City Royals are in first place in mid-August. And they're the hottest team in baseball. That's okay. You can clap. It's all right. It's all right. It's all right. We can do that. And this week, it was a great week to be a Royals fan because there was some real magic around the team. And that magic revolved, oddly enough, around a man from South Korea named Sung-Woo Lee. Now, who is Sung-Woo Lee? He's a Royals fan from Seoul. And he started following the Royals in 1995 because he saw the stadium on TV and thought the stadium was beautiful. And he's followed the Royals diligently, watching the highlights on ESPN. And before you could watch every game on TV or the internet, that's what he would do. And when you could buy a cable package to watch the games, he would get up at 3 a.m. South Korea time to watch the Royals before he went to work. Now, truly what makes the story amazing is there is really no reason why, if you are not forced to be a fan of the Kansas City Royals by being from here or being a family member of someone who actually works for the team, that you would choose to be a fan of the Royals. You know as well as I do that our beloved baseball franchise currently holds the record for the longest playoff drought in professional sports, almost 29 years. And it is not like the team has had a lot of near misses. It is like they've been close a lot of times. They've been historically bad. Since 1995, almost 20 years, the Royals have had exactly 2 winning seasons. They've averaged more than 90 losses a year, and most nights the biggest cheer you find out at the ballpark was when Mustard won the hot dog derby. I mean, that's how it all worked. Sung-Woo traveled to Kansas City for the first time this last week. He attended his first ever Royals game 2 Saturdays ago. The score was tied 0-0 in the middle of the 5th, and they showed his picture on the Jumbotron. The very next batter for the Royals hit a home run. Monday evening, Sung-Woo threw out the first pitch, and by the end of the night, the Royals had won their 8th straight game, and they were in first place for the first time in more than a decade. Now, against all appearances, all reason, all common sense, Sung-Woo endured a long reality of losing. He waited upon the promise of a winning team, and he was rewarded. We're all being rewarded who have waited a long time. But to get there, we've had to wait. We've had to wait a really long time. And we all spend time waiting in between hope and reality. Most of our life, we live in the uncomfortable space between what we want to be and what really is. And for some people, this reality is so unpleasant, it is so painful, it is easier to just give up hope. It is easier to make disappointment a way of life. And so we choose to either ignore the present, ignore what is really going on around us, or we fall victim to a tyranny of low expectations, never believing that anything good, anything great can ever happen to us in our life. And this is where a lot of people live. Overcoming the reality of our present is really hard to do. But the believer in Jesus, the woman or the man who trusts in his covenant, well, we can face reality, no matter how hard it is, because we understand the permanency of God's promise. We understand that He is redeeming all things. We understand that He is making all things new, that He is on a mission to take this sinful and broken world and wash it anew in His grace and love and power and present it spotless to the Father. The believer has the ability to live in the middle ground between the reality of the present and the promise of redemption tomorrow. And we are taught this by the Holy Spirit through Abraham, how to live in the peril of the present with the hope of tomorrow. We meet Abraham today in the most difficult time of life anyone will face, the death of someone that they love deeply, 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 profoundly, his wife. Sarah died at the age of 127, we are told. Can you imagine losing your wife, losing your husband after being married for that length of time? How did Abraham navigate this difficult time in his life? Well, the first thing we see is that Abraham mourned, but he did not despair. He mourned, but he did not despair. See, there's a difference between mourning and despair. Mourning is temporary. Mourning is temporary. Despair is permanent. Abraham was bruised by Sarah's death, but he was not broken. He loved his wife. Now, like most marriages, they had some ups and downs. They didn't always see eye to eye. The Bible records some sharp words between them a time or two. They made some poor decisions, but they were married a long time. And Abraham loved her deeply. When she died, he went in where her body lay and he sat with her. And he wept and he mourned for days. We don't see a lot of instances of husbands mourning their wives in the Bible, but Abraham mourned Sarah. He was faithful to God. Because he was faithful to God, he was faithful to his wife. She was precious to him. But Abraham, he didn't stay there. Genesis 23, verses 2 through 3. Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And then Abraham rose up from before his dead. There's a real temptation today to define ourselves by our despair. In fact, I know more people today that define themselves by despair, by just losing hope than I ever have in my life. In part, it's because we think things are only going to get worse. And it's also because we believe that people who are wounded, people who are hurting, they have sort of this gravitas about them, sort of this wisdom about them, a depth that others do not possess. They feel something in an age where we are told to be happy, and so we believe that they're strong. It's a myth. It's an absolute myth. No one is strong enough to carry pain permanently. No one is strong enough to carry pain permanently. We're just not made to. We're made for joy. We're not made for pain. And in our world, I think we are seeing the results of people carrying around pain becoming permanent. How else can you explain the hatred of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, killing people because of what they believe, driving women and children into the desert to die because they claim Jesus? How can you explain rioting and looting in Ferguson, if not pain? Now, of course, it's easy for someone to say, oh, you just need to feel better. And does anything make us worse than someone trying to raise our spirits by pulling our attitude down? Does that ever work at all? I remember saying to someone once, you have so much to live for. And they responded, oh, really? Tell me one thing. And I hesitated for a second. They're like, I don't, do I? But that's where some people live. The obvious answer is what we have to live for is our future. And what does that future hold? When we trust in Jesus, when we trust in his covenant, we can know that we have a future full of promise ahead. We can know that. That is his covenant with us. Speaking of burials, we had a very unique burial experience in our house a few weeks ago. Calvin has hermit crabs. And while we were on vacation, one of them died. And it was the first pet death experience we had ever had in our family, and it hit all the boys really, really hard. So in the middle of the afternoon, we buried little Sylvester, shell and all, about 2 feet deep in the ground in the backyard, complete with a funeral service. I recited Romans 8 and Revelation 21 about God making all things new. 4-year-old Hank proclaimed, good news, Sylvester is with Jesus now. And it was just this beautiful event. Unfortunately, Hank could not have been more wrong. At about 10:30 p.m. that night, Jen said to me, I'm not sure Sylvester was dead. I've been reading online that hermit crabs molt, and when they molt, it looks a lot like they're dead. So at 11:45, with a thunderstorm boring down, Jen had a flashlight while I dug up Sylvester from 24 inches below the earth. It was like some scene from a 1930s horror movie. And we found his shell, wonder of wonders, and Sylvester was alive, still. You see, apparently hermit crabs molt so they can grow. They shed their exoskeleton so they can mature, and it looks a lot like death. But take my word for it, it's not. It's not death. The same thing is true for us. We all go through times that are so painful that it feels like death. No one likes death. No one likes it. No one likes pain. But pain isn't death. It only leads to death when pain becomes permanent. Mourning is good. We should mourn. The Bible teaches there is a time to mourn, but there is never a time to despair. Never a time to despair when we trust God's promise. Second, Abraham believed that God's eternal promise has real-world results. his eternal promise has real-world results. So Abraham asked to buy some land in a place where he was a foreigner, where he was a stranger, a sojourner, so he could bury his wife whom he loved. Genesis 23, verses 3 through 4. Abraham rose up from before the dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. Now, where Abraham chose to bury Sarah is very important. He chose a cave once owned by a man named Machpelah, not far from Hebron, and he said that would be the burial place for Sarah and himself and Isaac and Isaac's wife Rebekah, their son Jacob, and his wife Leah. 3 generations were buried there in that cave. In Abraham's day and age, place was exceedingly important. When Abraham's great-grandson Joseph died, he made the family promise not to bury him in Egypt. The man who saved Egypt, who was second in command only to Pharaoh, could have built himself his own pyramid. But instead he said, place my bones in a coffin. And when God's people left Egypt 400 years later to go back to the promised land, they carried Joseph's bones with them. Somebody had the unpleasant job of hauling his bones with them for 40 years in the wilderness because they didn't place him in his final resting space until they crossed over into the promised land. That's how important place was. This never-ending war between Israel and Palestine over who can live on the land. It gives us some indication of how important place is, even today in that part of the world. Now we may say here, well, why was this land so important to Abraham? Why this piece of land? Why couldn't he have just buried Sarah back where they came from, someplace where he wasn't a sojourner and a stranger, back in his own homeland? That would have been nice back there. Well, you see, God made him a promise. Not only did he promise that his descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky, he promised them that they would have a place to call their own. And Abraham left behind his family and left behind his friends, everything he had ever known, and he followed God, and God made him a promise. Genesis 12:7. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. And he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. See, God's eternal promise always has real-world results. You know, a lot of us trust God to adjust our attitude, to make us happier or make us joyful or give us more peace. We believe that. Fewer trust God to make real-world, tangible changes in our life, to act in real time, to alter our circumstances. But that is exactly what Jesus, who is the Lord of all creation, does. You won't find a place in the Gospels where Jesus met someone who had an ailment, an infirmity, a sickness, and he gave him a pat on the back or a pithy word of advice, and he said, you know, I'm going to change your attitude about your leprosy. This is really a blessing from me. You don't see that. Jesus works out his love for us in real time through a change in our circumstances. Now, this isn't to say we always get what we want. It isn't to say that we always get even what we desperately desire. But we can have more than just this ethereal hope. We can do more than hope for Jesus to give us a positive mental attitude. We can hope for him to positively alter our world, even renew his world, restore it. That's his plan. That is his plan. After World War II, the Nazi high command was put on trial at Nuremberg, and 11 of them were found guilty and hanged, and their bodies were cremated, and their ashes put into 11 aluminum cylinders, 16 inches tall and 6 inches around. Some American officers carried those cylinders to a villa that sat high on a hill above a stream in Germany. And on the banks of that stream, they smashed the containers of ashes with axes, and they stomped on them with their boot heels, grinding the ashes into the sandy banks of the stream, where the waters of the stream eventually carried the ashes to the Danube River and then out to the sea. Now, one of the things we believe as a Christian is in the resurrection of the body. We don't believe we exist eternally as spirits, but we exist in our physical bodies. And we believe that God will repair and he will restore and renew and knit back together that physical body. At least 2 of those 11 Nazi officers, while on trial, confessed their sin, sought Jesus' forgiveness, and lived as men filled with the Holy Spirit for the final weeks and months of their life. God's promise is very, very clear that at the end of all history, Jesus will descend from heaven with the cry that he is making all things new, and the dead will be raised imperishable. This is the gospel. This is the gospel. And indeed, it sounds impossible that a Nazi officer responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, whose ashes were washed out to sea, could one day be knit back together in bodily form and stand in the grace of God eternally in his glory. Yet that's what we believe. How impossible must it have been for Abraham to believe that one day his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, living almost alone in the promised land, in the land which he dwelt as a stranger, that they would someday fill that promised land. Yet he chose to believe. You see, this is the far end of faith. This is faith that it's not a happy wish, it's not a pleasant thought, it's not a delusional diversion. Faith in Jesus is a conviction that God's eternal purpose has real-world results, that he is the Lord, and he will do what he declares in our time. And third and finally, Abraham believed living faith is costly. Living faith is costly. For his entire life, Abraham was a blessing to his neighbors. He was a blessing to his neighbors. God called him to be a blessing, and he was a blessing to his neighbors. And because he had blessed them, they immediately agreed to give him a burial plot that he asked for. A cave that sat at the far end of a field once owned by a man named Machpelah. And the current owner agreed to give that cave to Abraham at an unbeatable price. He said, the cave is free. It's yours. It's yours to have at no cost. Go ahead and bury your dead in it. And Abraham, he was humbled by this grand gesture of grace, but he knew that to really possess the land, to own it, to stake a claim that would endure for generations, it should cost him something. Genesis 23, verses 12 through 6. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, but if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead there. And Ephraim answered Abraham, my Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. And Abraham listened to Ephraim, and Abraham weighed out for Ephraim the silver he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver. You see, grace is free. Grace is free. But that does not mean that it should cost us nothing. A living faith is a costly faith. We sort of have this idea that because grace is free, that it just doesn't require anything of me. We have sort of what I call a Tinkerbell mentality to faith. If we only believe, we are told again and again. Jesus is grace, so we think, well, it complements my life rather than costing me anything. And so grace that is inconvenient, or grace that challenges our worldview, or grace that calls into question how we live, grace that is painful, well, that's largely unfamiliar to most of us. The church today is marked by an unwillingness on the part of most Christians to change our life in any significant way because we have received Jesus' grace. Most of us live today exactly like our non-Christian neighbors. We are, by and large, consumers of a spiritual product that eases our conscience and salves our soul, rather than disciples of a crucified King. And when grace is inconvenient, when faith is uncomfortable, we seek the path of least resistance. But as brothers and sisters of the living Lord Christ, we are made of sterner stuff. The horrific specter of Christians in Iraq being systematically killed and women and children driven out into the desert to starve and die of thirst is a stark reminder to an American church of just what faith can cost. We have been redeemed for so much more than to choose a church that is convenient, for a faith that costs nothing, a grace that results in an unremarkable life. Abraham knew, he knew that for him to truly possess the land gracefully given to him by his friend, it had to cost him something. It may have been freely given, but for him to truly grasp it, it had to cost him something. And the same is true for us. If we want Jesus' grace in our life to count for anything, if we want to possess it, if we want it to endure for generations, realize the difference it can make in our life, and more importantly, the difference in the world around us, we must allow grace to cost us something. Why is Sung-Woo Lee's story so compelling? Why is it so inspiring? Why is one baseball fan from South Korea energized a city and been covered by NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ESPN, CBS, Sports Illustrated? It's the biggest story about the Royals in 30 years. Why did the entire city roll out the red carpet for this guy and give him a Royals jersey and a Chiefs jersey and barbecue and let him throw out the first pitch and turn him into a minor celebrity? Well, it's because he believed. He believed. He was faithful when there was no earthly reason for him to be faithful. Well, how do we know he believed? How do you know that? Well, because it cost him something. He got up at 3 a.m. to watch the games before he went to work. He bought merchandise, corresponded for 20 years with Royals fans and players across the ocean. He suffered when they lost. He celebrated when they won. A jaded blogger who was usually savagely critical about the team wrote about Sung-Woo. He's done something improbable. He's made me want to believe again. And if you read this guy, you'd know how improbable that really is. A question every Christian needs to ask ourselves is, have I made anyone want to believe? Has the witness of Jesus' grace at work in my life caused anyone to take notice? Have I allowed Jesus' grace to cost me anything so that someone might be so compelled to think it's actually true? Here's why this is so important. It's important because the truth is most people live in that uncomfortable space between hope and reality, between what is and what we want to be. And it is a constant battle to face our reality. It is a never-ending struggle against the tyranny of low expectations. But there are rare women and men who are able to stand amidst the tide, who are able to ride a wave of hope through the storm and point to the coming dawn. And they are so rare, they are so unique, like Abraham, that we tell their story again and again and again and again, plumbing it for meaning 4,000 years later. And my friends, this is the role for which you and I are made, and remade and remade and remade again. This is our role. This is our destiny, to be a part of Jesus' mission to redeem the world. And as he drags his creation from the painful present reality, the reality of Ferguson, the reality of people who kill and torture in the name of a false god, the reality of a war over the land that God's only Son called home, the reality of lives of hopelessness and unmet need, and existence where we bury those in the hard earth whom we've loved out of our sight, and we mourn their loss. We have been blessed by Jesus to be a blessing to that broken world, a world whose Savior is not burying it out of sight and out of mind, but is resurrecting all of us to a glorious new reality. And it is for that new reality that we wait in hope. Amen.